The fog is lifting. Clarity is calling you forward. Welcome to Forward in Freedom. I'm Tanya Johnson. This is where awareness becomes power. Let's move forward in freedom.
Have you ever started becoming healthier only to realize that certain relationships suddenly felt more distant? Not because there was conflict, not because you stopped caring, but because the role you once played in those relationships started changing. And that can feel deeply confusing. Because if healing is supposed to make life better, why can growth sometimes feel lonely at first? Why do some relationships weaken once you stop over functioning emotionally? And how do you know when you're truly losing connection or simply outgrowing unhealthy dynamics? That's where we're headed today. And I think the conversation is going to explain something that many people have been feeling for a very long time. One of the hardest parts of healing is realizing that healthier choices often change relationship dynamics before they create emotional peace. And if you don't understand that clearly, you can mistake growth for loss. So, why does becoming healthier sometimes feel lonelier? It's because growth changes the role you once played in certain relationships. That's the shift that many people are feeling but struggling to explain. When you stop emotionally rescuing, over accommodating, carrying everyone, constantly self sacrificing, the dynamics change. And sometimes the connection weakens because the relationship was heavily dependent on your emotional overextension, not mutual health. That realization can feel painful at first because growth forces you to see which relationships were sustained by genuine connection and which ones were sustained by your exhaustion. I can remember speaking with someone who said, Tanya, the moment I stopped always being the person everyone leaned on emotionally, people started acting like I had changed. Not because she became cruel, not because she stopped caring, but because access changed. And that shift exposed how much of the relationship depended on her emotional availability. Some relationships feel different once you stop over functioning inside them. Something that I came to understand over time is that growth can create grief even when it is healthy. Because healing changes what feels emotionally familiar. You stop forcing conversations that drain you. You stop chasing a connection that only survives through self sacrifice. You stop shrinking yourself just to maintain emotional harmony. And during that process, there can be sadness. Not always because the relationship was unhealthy, but because part of you remembers how hard you worked to keep it functioning. That's why growth can feel emotionally confusing. Part of you is moving forward, while another part is grieving what no longer fits. Sometimes what people call missing the relationship is actually missing the emotional role they occupied inside it. The role of keeping the peace, holding everything together, overgiving, emotionally rescuing, making dysfunction manageable. And when that role begins disappearing in the relationship, things can feel unfamiliar. Not because the connection disappeared completely, but because you are no longer carrying the dynamic the same way. And that realization can hit deeply because now you're forced to ask, if I stop over functioning completely, what remains naturally? That question changes everything. Some relationships felt stable because you were carrying the instability for everyone. Why do some relationships weaken once you stop overfunctioning? Because some connections were unintentionally built around emotional imbalance. One person was constantly caring, one person was constantly accommodating, one person was constantly absorbing tension. And once healthier boundaries began developing, the relationship has to adjust. Some relationships do adjust. Some become healthier over time, but others reveal they only felt stable while you were emotionally overextending yourself. And that truth can be difficult to accept, especially when history and loyalty or emotional attachment is involved. Growth reveals whether a relationship was built on mutual connection or emotional dependency. For many people, this becomes emotionally confusing because loneliness during growth can feel like proof that something is wrong. But not every uncomfortable transition is unhealthy. Sometimes you are not losing a healthy connection. Sometimes you're losing unhealthy familiarity. There is a difference. Unhealthy familiarity says, stay who you were so that the dynamics stays comfortable. Growth says you cannot heal and remain emotionally committed to dysfunction at the same time. And that tension can feel deeply uncomfortable before it starts making sense emotionally. Some people miss the version of you that made unhealthy dynamics easier to maintain. While listening today, you may have realized that some of your emotional exhaustion has been connected to roles that you carried for years without fully recognizing it. And that's exactly the kind of work that we unpack through clear direction coaching. Because many people don't realize how much emotional exhaustion, loneliness, or confusion is connected to unhealthy relationship loss. If you're ready to strengthen your emotional clarity, confidence, and boundaries, you can book a 15-minute consultation at www.cleardirectioncoaching.com. And if relationship dynamics are part of your healing journey, the Gathering Alliance Relationship Assessment is a valuable resource to help you evaluate patterns with greater clarity. But there's another layer to this conversation that many people overlook. Sometimes growth feels lonely because you're learning how to connect without abandoning yourself in the process. Many people learn to maintain closeness through overgiving, overhelping, overexplaining, overcaring, over-adjusting. So when healthier boundaries began developing, a connection can temporarily feel unfamiliar because now you're learning how to be loved without emotionally overperforming first. And that adjustment can feel uncomfortable, especially for people who learn very early that love had to be earned through emotional labor. Anything that constantly requires emotional depletion in order to maintain a connection should be examined carefully because God is not asking you to destroy your peace in order to keep a relationship. Healthy relationships allow honesty, emotional safety, mutual responsibility, growth, respect, not constant emotional exhaustion. You should not have to emotionally become exhausted in order to stay connected. At this season of growing, as it continues, something powerful begins happening. You become more comfortable with peace that is not performance based. You begin recognizing that emotional exhaustion was never proof of deeper love. And slowly, you stop chasing a connection that only survives through self sacrifice. That does not mean that you stop loving people. It means that you stop losing yourself trying to maintain unhealthy dynamics. And eventually, you begin creating spaces for healthier relationships that are built on honesty, mutual respect, emotional maturity, spiritual alignment, peace, not survival, not emotional dependency, peace. And one of the most freeing parts of growth is realizing you no longer have to earn connection through exhaustion. You no longer have to overfunction in order to feel valuable. You no longer have to emotionally disappear just to keep relationships intact. And that freedom changes the way you love, the way you connect, the way you see yourself. You were never meant to earn love through emotional exhaustion. Never. Watch what happens the next time loneliness makes you question your growth. Do you immediately assume that you're doing something wrong, that you become too distant, that you're losing everyone, that you should return to unhealthy patterns for connection? Or can you recognize that growth sometimes creates temporary emotional distance before healthier alignment develops? Because not every lonely season is a sign that you're failing. Some seasons feel lonely because your life is no longer built around emotional survival. And healing can feel lonely when you're no longer connecting through dysfunction. Think honestly about the relationships that feel different in this season of your life. Consider this honestly. Where have I confused emotional familiarity with a healthy connection? What relationships still feel safe and mutual when I stop over functioning completely? And how might my relationships shift if I stop carrying dynamics that were never meant for me to carry? I think this conversation is going to resonate deeply with a lot of people, especially those who've experienced the emotional shift that comes when growth changes relationship dynamics. So I'd love to hear from you. What part of becoming healthier has felt the loneliest for you? And what relationships or patterns started looking different once you stopped over functioning emotionally? I've been reading your comments. Thank you so much. And many of your stories are helping other listeners feel understood in their own process. And if these conversations have been helping you to grow, gain clarity, or feel less alone, make sure that you subscribe, like, and share the podcast with someone who may need this message too. And if today's episode brought language to something that you've been quietly navigating, this may be the right time to go deeper. You can book a 15-minute consultation through www.cleardirectioncoaching.com. You can also explore the Gathering Alliance Relationship Assessment and my book, A Woman's Exodus Only by Grace. All the resources and links are available in the episode notes. Over the next few episodes, we're going to keep unpacking some deeper conversations around growth, identity, relationships, and emotional healing. And one of the conversations we'll be exploring soon is this: how do you stop seeking validation from people who no longer understand your direction? Why do some people become uncomfortable once you stop needing their approval? And how do you remain confident in your growth when external affirmation starts disappearing? That conversation is going to unlock a lot for people. I'm Tanya J, and this is the work of walking forward in freedom. Until we meet again, move forward in freedom.